In a world where power and control reigned supreme, one girl was torn between fate and family. With her wicked stepmother's betrayal setting her life on an unexpected path, a young woman's strength and the forces of destiny would soon collide. Prepare to witness an incredible journey of survival, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of freedom. It was a day like any other. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm orange glow across the village. Birds chirped, and the familiar hum of life began to take its place in the morning routine. The girl, a humble soul with dreams as bright as the rising sun, had spent most of her young life doing what was expected of her. She worked diligently around the house, performing the tasks assigned by her stepmother, always careful not to anger the woman who seemed to have grown fond of the power she wielded over her. Her days were a monotonous repetition of chores, fetching water from the well, tending to the hearth, sweeping the floors, and preparing meals for the family. Despite the tediousness of her daily life, she always carried hope in her heart. She dreamed of a day when she would find her true purpose, when she would be loved and valued for who she was, not for what she could provide. But on that fateful morning, those dreams began to unravel. Her stepmother had summoned her to the parlor with an eerie sense of finality in her voice. The girl, accustomed to her stepmother's cold indifference, didn't think much of it. But as she entered the room, something felt off. The air was thick with tension, and her stepmother sat in the corner, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her face a mask of unreadable emotion. The girl stood quietly, waiting for her stepmother to speak. But what she heard next would shake her to the very core. "You're going," her stepmother said, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Where?" Her stepmother's eyes didn't meet hers. Instead, they were fixed on a bundle of gold coins that sat neatly on the table. "You're being sold." For a moment, the words didn't register. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, and the room had suddenly grown cold. Her breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back. "Sold? But what about our family?" Her stepmother's lips curled into a thin, pitiful smile. "You've never been part of this family. You've only been a burden." Her words, though cold, were sharp like daggers. "I found someone willing to take you. You will be their problem now." The girl's mind raced. She tried to grasp the enormity of the situation, but it felt like her world was crumbling around her. How could her stepmother, the very woman who had promised to care for her, betray her like this? She had always treated her as less than, but this was beyond cruelty. It was pure, heartless betrayal. "How could you?" The girl's voice trembled, her hands shaking as she reached for her stepmother. But the woman remained unfazed, unmoving, cold. "You're nothing but a tool to be used," her stepmother spat. "I've had enough of you." The girl felt a rush of emotions flood her system. Shock, anger, disbelief, and most of all, pain. Her stepmother's words echoed in her mind, over and over again, drowning out everything else. How had she gone from being a member of the family to an expendable object? How could someone who had cared for her, or so she thought, throw her away so easily? "You won't get away with this," the girl whispered, though there was little hope in her voice. She could feel the finality in her stepmother's decision. There was no turning back. This was happening, and she was powerless to stop it. Her stepmother's gaze hardened. "Go pack your things," she commanded, her voice like ice. The girl turned and walked out of the room, her heart heavy with sorrow. She didn't know where she would go or what her future held, but she knew one thing: her life as she knew it had come to an end. She had been sold, and there was no escape. She couldn't understand why this had to happen to her. She had always been obedient, always worked hard. And yet, this was how her stepmother had repaid her. As she packed her meager belongings into a small bag, she tried to hold on to the memories of happier times, but they slipped away like sand through her fingers. Her life had been turned upside down by one simple decision, a decision made by the one person who was supposed to protect her. There was no love, no care, only cruelty and indifference. Her thoughts drifted to the life she had dreamed of. A life filled with love, with purpose. She had always hoped that one day, someone would see her for who she truly was and appreciate her for all that she had to offer. But now, those dreams felt impossible. How could she ever hope to find love and happiness when her very existence had been bought and sold like a commodity? With a heavy heart, she left the room and headed toward the door. As she stepped outside, the air felt different, colder, heavier. The sky seemed darker, as if the universe itself was mourning her loss. She walked toward the unfamiliar road that would lead her away from the life she had known, but as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving behind something more than just her home. She was leaving behind her sense of self, her belief that she was worth something. And as she walked further into the unknown, she couldn't help but wonder, would she ever find the love and belonging she had longed for? Or had her stepmother's betrayal truly stolen everything from her, including the chance for a better future? The girl walked through the village, her heart weighed down by the betrayal that now defined her life. She could hear the sounds of daily life, children playing, women gossiping, men working, yet none of it reached her. The world around her felt distant, as if she were trapped in a bubble, isolated from everything she had once known. She had been raised in this village, surrounded by familiar faces and a culture she had been a part of since childhood. Yet now, she felt like an outsider. The people who had once been her neighbors, her friends, seemed like strangers, their faces blurred by the anger and sorrow that clouded her vision. No one had come to her aid, no one had questioned her stepmother's actions. It was as if her pain was invisible, too insignificant for anyone to acknowledge. As she walked along the narrow path leading out of the village, she couldn't help but wonder what her future held. Where would she go? Who would take her in? She had no family left to rely on, her parents had passed away years ago, and her stepmother had never considered her anything more than a burden. She had been tossed aside, discarded like a worn-out piece of clothing. The thought stung, but she quickly pushed it to the back of her mind. Crying over her past would not change anything. If she was to survive, she had to focus on the future, whatever it might be. Her feet carried her further from the village, toward the unknown. The road stretched ahead, winding through dense forests and rolling hills, with no end in sight. The girl had never ventured beyond the village's boundaries before, and now she was faced with a world that seemed both vast and unforgiving. The sense of isolation grew stronger with each step, and she felt as though she were walking through a dream in which she had lost control, where everything had spiraled out of her grasp. But there was no turning back now. Her fate had already been sealed, and as much as she hated to admit it, she felt a strange sense of determination growing within her. She had been cast aside, abandoned by the one person who should have protected her, but that didn't mean her story was over. She wasn't ready to give up on life, not yet. There was a fire inside her, a desire to fight for something more. She couldn't let herself be defined by the actions of her stepmother. There had to be more to her life than this. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, the girl found herself at a crossroads. She could continue on the path ahead, unsure of where it would lead, or she could turn back. But what was there to return to? The home she had known no longer existed. Her stepmother had made sure of that. The girl stood still for a moment, allowing the weight of her decision to settle over her. Her heart ached, but she had no choice. She couldn't let her stepmother's betrayal be the end of her story. With renewed resolve, she chose the unknown. She would face whatever challenges came her way, no matter how difficult they might be. She couldn't allow herself to be a victim anymore. She had to take control of her destiny. She wasn't just a girl who had been sold off by her stepmother. She was a person with a purpose, a life waiting to unfold. The journey was long and lonely, and the girl encountered many obstacles along the way. She had to navigate through dense forests, cross rivers, and climb steep hills. Each day, she grew stronger, more determined. She learned to rely on herself, to trust her instincts, and to face the harsh realities of the world head-on. But it wasn't all hardship. Along the way, she met kind-hearted strangers who helped her when she needed it most. There was an old woman who offered her food and shelter for the night, a group of travelers who shared their stories with her, and a young man who guided her across a treacherous mountain pass. These encounters reminded her that there was still good in the world, even if it seemed hidden beneath layers of pain and suffering. The girl's journey was not just physical, it was emotional as well. Every step she took forced her to confront the truth of her past. She thought about her stepmother, the woman who had cast her aside without a second thought, and she realized something that had eluded her before. Her stepmother's actions did not define her. Yes, her stepmother had sold her off, but that didn't make her worthless. She was not a commodity to be bought and sold. She was a person with worth, with dreams, with a future that was hers to create. As the days turned into weeks, the girl's strength grew, and so did her sense of purpose. She began to understand that her journey was not just about survival, It was about reclaiming her life. The woman she was becoming was not a victim, but a warrior. A warrior who would stop at nothing to fight for the life she deserved. One evening, as she sat by the fire, reflecting on how far she had come, she realized that she had already found something precious along the way: hope. It had been buried deep within her, but now it shone brighter than ever before. No matter how difficult the path ahead might be, she knew she would face it with courage and strength. The past was behind her, and she was no longer bound by her stepmother's betrayal. The future was hers to write, and she was ready to write her own story. As she stood, ready to continue her journey, she understood that this was just the beginning. What had started as a painful chapter in her life was transforming into a story of resilience, hope, and determination. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. And this was only the start of the woman she would become. As the days passed, the girl continued her journey through dense forests, rugged terrains, and challenging rivers. The beauty of nature around her contrasted with the ache in her heart. It was as if the world, in all its vastness, was reminding her of the endless possibilities ahead. But, despite the seemingly endless horizon, her past kept chasing her. Her thoughts often drifted back to the day she left the village. It was a painful moment, one filled with tears and confusion. Her stepmother's coldness had left a scar in her soul, but with each step she took, the scar began to heal. Her emotions were complex, an ever-changing mix of anger, sorrow, and determination. At first, she had cried for the life she had lost, for the home that was no longer hers. But now, tears were few, and there was something stronger within her, something that urged her to keep moving forward. One night, as the full moon rose above the trees, the girl sat by a fire she had made herself. She had become accustomed to making camp, tending the fire, and cooking simple meals. These tasks, once daunting, had become second nature. Her strength had not only grown physically but mentally as well. It was in these quiet moments of solitude that she began to understand her true potential. The girl's hands trembled as she stirred the pot of stew, but it wasn't from fear, it was from realization. She had survived all of this alone. She had taken control of her destiny. She was no longer dependent on anyone for her survival. Her stepmother's betrayal had set her free in a way. In that dark moment of abandonment, she had discovered her power to persevere, to forge her own path, and to survive. Her thoughts were interrupted by the crackling of the fire, and for a moment, she felt a sense of peace. She had walked so far from the village, but with each step, she had come closer to the woman she was meant to become. The world around her had been harsh, but it had also been kind. The strangers who had crossed her path had shown her that there was compassion in the world. The old woman who had shared her food, the travelers who had shared their stories, each of them had left a mark on her heart, a reminder that kindness was never too far from reach. Yet, the girl's journey was not just about the people she met, it was about the internal transformation taking place within her. She was no longer the girl who had been cast aside. She had grown stronger, more resilient. Every challenge she faced was an opportunity to test her limits and discover new strengths within herself. That night, as she sat by the fire, she made a promise to herself. She would never allow anyone, not even her stepmother, to define her. She would never let the scars of her past determine her future. The woman she was becoming was fierce, determined, and unapologetically strong. She had found her voice, and now it was time to speak her truth to the world. The next day, as the sun rose over the horizon, the girl packed her things and set out again. She no longer walked through the world with the same uncertainty she had before. Now, each step felt purposeful. She was on a journey not just to survive, but to thrive. She had faced the worst that life could throw at her, and she had emerged stronger. The girl who had been sold off, abandoned, and betrayed was now becoming a woman who understood her worth and her power. Days turned into weeks, and the girl's confidence continued to grow. Along the way, she learned new skills, encountered more people who offered help, and faced situations that tested her resolve. With each passing day, she felt less like the victim of her past and more like the architect of her own future. She crossed paths with a group of nomads one afternoon, and though she was initially hesitant to join them, she soon realized that they were kind-hearted and generous. The leader of the group, an older man with a wealth of knowledge about the land, took her under his wing. He taught her survival skills that she hadn't yet learned: how to read the stars for navigation, how to identify edible plants, and how to protect herself from dangers lurking in the wild. The nomads, like the others she had met along her journey, provided her with something crucial: hope. They showed her that there were good people in the world, and that kindness was not as rare as she had once believed. But more than that, they showed her that strength was not just physical, it was mental and emotional as well. The girl had to confront her fears, her doubts, and her insecurities, and as she did, she became more resilient. But even as her life seemed to become more stable, the girl could not ignore the memories of her past. The images of her stepmother's cold eyes, the harsh words that had been spoken, and the feelings of abandonment would never fully disappear. However, she had learned something invaluable. These memories no longer held the same power over her. They were just that, memories. The present and the future were hers to shape, and she was determined to make the most of it. By the time she reached the outskirts of a bustling city, the girl was no longer the same person who had walked out of the village so many weeks ago. She had become a woman of strength, wisdom, and resilience. Her journey was far from over, but she now walked forward with her head held high, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had the power to face them. She had started her journey with nothing but the clothes on her back, but by the end of it, she had found something far more valuable: herself. As the girl neared the bustling city that had once seemed so distant and out of reach, she felt a mixture of anticipation and hesitation. It was here that her journey would take another turn. The city stood before her like a massive, breathing entity, full of noise, life, and activity. It was a place where people came and went, where hopes and dreams were made or crushed. But the girl, now a young woman, was not intimidated. Instead, she felt an unfamiliar confidence that arose from everything she had experienced. She stepped cautiously into the heart of the city, where the sounds of merchants calling out their wares, the laughter of children, and the hum of life blended into a beautiful cacophony. The towering buildings and crowded streets were a sharp contrast to the quiet wilderness she had just left behind. But as she walked among the people, her senses heightened. There was a sense of familiarity in the bustling atmosphere, as if the very essence of this city was woven into her own being. She wandered for days, meeting new faces, hearing stories, and witnessing the complexity of city life. Yet, something was missing. She felt disconnected in a way. The kindness she had received from the nomads, the wisdom she had learned along the way, it all seemed so far removed from the city's harsh realities. The girl knew that she could never be content in a place like this. Not until she found the answers that had driven her journey from the very beginning. One evening, after several days of wandering, she found herself standing at the edge of a busy marketplace. It was there that she saw a familiar face, a woman standing behind a stall, her face etched with years of bitterness. The girl's heart raced as memories of her stepmother flashed through her mind. There was no mistaking it. The woman behind the stall was none other than her stepmother. The years had not been kind to her. The once glamorous woman was now worn down by age and hardship. Her once beautiful features were now overshadowed by a harsh expression and a hunched posture. The girl stared at her for a long time, unable to comprehend the emotions flooding her chest. Anger, sadness, and confusion swirled within her, but above all, she felt a strange sense of closure. With trembling hands, the girl approached her stepmother, who didn't seem to recognize her at first. She took a deep breath, the weight of the years lifting from her shoulders. As she stood before the woman who had once tormented her, she spoke words that she had never thought possible. "I am not the helpless girl you once knew," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I have survived. I have become more than you could ever imagine." Her stepmother's eyes widened with recognition, but the woman's expression remained cold, distant. She tried to dismiss the girl as if she were just another beggar in the marketplace, but the girl stood her ground, refusing to let the past dictate her future any longer. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, her stepmother spoke, her voice dripping with guilt and regret. "You think you've learned everything, don't you?" she sneered. "You've been playing the victim all these years. You don't understand what it means to be truly powerless." But the girl's gaze never wavered. She had faced hardships, betrayals, and countless obstacles, and she knew now that the real power did not come from what others did to her, it came from how she chose to respond. "I understand power," the girl replied. "And it's not about the circumstances we are born into, or the people who try to tear us down. It's about rising despite it all. It's about choosing to fight for yourself." The confrontation felt surreal, like a dream finally coming to life. The girl had waited so long for this moment, And yet, in the end, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing her stepmother for the years of mistreatment. It was about acknowledging the journey she had taken to get here, the strength she had discovered within herself and the woman she had become. For the first time, the girl felt completely free. The weight of the past had been lifted, and in its place stood a future that was hers to create. Her stepmother, still unwilling to accept the truth, tried to leave, but the girl stepped forward and said one last thing. "I don't need your approval. I don't need your love. I've learned to love myself and value who I am. And that is more than you'll ever understand." As her stepmother walked away, the girl stood tall, her heart filled not with bitterness, but with peace. She had discovered the truth she had sought for so long, that no one, not even those who tried to break her, could take away her power. Her past, though painful, had shaped her into the woman she was today. And in that moment, she knew that nothing could ever diminish the light she carried within. She turned her back to the marketplace, a new sense of purpose driving her forward. The journey wasn't over, but she no longer felt lost. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that her strength, her heart, and her resilience were enough to face any challenge the world had to offer.